We are at the Emily Dickinson house in Amherst, Massachusetts, and we're about to go on to the Homestead.
It says that's the Evergreens, and this is the Homestead.
Awesome. And it was probably extremely beautiful once upon a time.
And his wife lived in that one.
Okay. This is a big house for the time.
But welcome, in any case. So this place, the town of Amherst and this house, the Homestead, would have been urgently important to Emily Dickinson. As I mentioned, she was born here. That was in 1830, and she died here in 1886 at the age of 55. And houses, actually, were a metaphor that she returned to a great deal in her writing. So we get, for example, the beginning of a well-known poem, "I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors." And the homestead was built in 1813 by the poet's grandfather. It was part, actually, of a working farm in Emily's lifetime, so it would have been 14 acres total. Across the street was the Dickinson Meadow, 11 acres of hayfields, essentially. Behind the house would have been a large barn with animals, quarters for the stablemen. Beyond that, gardens and orchards, apple and pear orchards, which we are doing our best to recreate with a few struggling trees at the moment. These are your hosts for the day. These are the poet's parents. Feel free to come around if you want to see them better. This is Emily Norcross Dickinson, the poet's mother. She was born in Munson, Massachusetts, about 22 miles from here, quite far from Amherst, certainly in the day. And she was born to a prominent family, the oldest of 9. Her father was responsible for starting an educational institution there in Munson, and she was a rather reluctant bride. Edward Dickinson was not the Dickinson of his somewhat later years. Here she comes with really a wild education for a woman of the early 19th century, but embraces her life as kind of the domestic goddess, if you will, and marries Edward, lifelong resident of Amherst. He was a lawyer, he was a politician, he represented Amherst in the state legislature, also in the U.S. Congress for a year. And he was treasurer of Amherst College for almost 40 years. And Edward was a man of great conviction and contradiction. So he was a supportive parent in many ways to Emily and her sister and brother, also extremely restrictive. He was anti-slavery, also anti-abolition. Okay.
Huh?
Yeah, how does that work? In principle, for what it was worth, he was anti-slavery. However, he was of the Whig Party, very conservative political party, believed very strongly in states' rights, and he would not have dreamed of touching the Southern states' rights to own slaves. So this is a huge debate in Emily's lifetime. Of course, the Civil War falls right in the middle of her life. Really, their friends ran the gamut in terms of where they fell on some of these big issues. Also, Emily writes in a letter about her father, "Father buys me many books, but begs me not to read them." In this room, the wall treatments and carpeting were actually recreated from diary accounts by Maddie Dickinson, the poet's niece. And actually, there's a story about the rug that women came early to Mrs. Dickinson's funeral to see the rug before too many people were standing on it because it was just all the rage. Berber carpet, yeah. And many originals in this room, if you care to know. Most of the room is original. So you would have been welcomed formally as a guest first here in the South Parlor. And you might be coming just to pay a call, or you might be coming to one of their larger events. So for example, they would hold commencement teas for Amherst College every year. And they would open up this double parlor, open up the window doors here, I'm not sure which one it was, and spill out onto the veranda. And between the acreage that was here and these kinds of events, there certainly were domestic servants that were helping upkeep the homestead. So for example, there was an African-American woman by the name of Eliza Thompson who would have helped serve those teas. Emily and her sister Lavinia would have also been asked to help with those teas, much to her dismay. And there were lots of Irish immigrants coming mid-century, taking domestic jobs, and there were two different Irish maids in the house. The second, Maggie Marr, actually worked for the family for 30 years. Emily would have come in contact with the folks that worked here both in the gardens and in the kitchen. She was the baker for the family and quite skilled at it. She says, "My kitchen, I think I called it. God forbid that it was or shall be my own. God keep me from what they call households." So she never had to marry. She never had to get a job to support herself. And this, along with that domestic help, are things that freed her up to write. So there's quite a correlation between whether or not there was a maid in the house and how many poems were being written. Very forward-facing, public-facing father and brother. So Edward and Emily's brother Austin were enmeshed in civic life in town, really kind of, building Amherst in the day. And this is one way, in a certain sense, that Emily traveled, quote unquote, or how the world kind of came to her, though she notoriously hated traveling. Because lots of change makers, lots of thinkers would have come through this parlor with, the sort of social posts that her family held. They did convince her to leave the state of Massachusetts once. In 1855, she visited Washington, D.C., where her father was still, holding his congressional term. And then they stopped in Philadelphia for a couple weeks on the way back from that. That was her one and only trip out of the state. She says, "The soul that hath a guest doth seldom go abroad. Diviner crowd at home, obliterate the need." See the three Dickinson children. So Emily is here on the left with the red hair at about age 9. She's the middle child. That's her older brother, William Austin Dickinson, or Austin, and her younger sister, Lavinia, whom they called Vinnie. The three were very close. All three of them lived out their lives here on the property. Vinnie, interestingly, also never married. And we'll get to Austin's story in just a moment. But the earliest existing writing we have from Emily was from age 11. She was writing to her brother Austin, whom she missed very much. He was away at school. And of her bond with her sister, she says it was early, earnest, indissoluble. The three were also quite different from each other, and Emily's sensitivity and intensity really sets her apart in many ways. So the editor of the Springfield Republican that I mentioned in the other room, Sam Bowles, he had something to say after a meeting with her. He says, "She quite impressed me with evidence of genius, but there's a wild, unsettled look about her that would frighten most men." She had high expectations of all her relationships, and one girlhood friend kind of sums it up with, she loved with all her might. So this is our nerve center. This is where we think she wrote the majority of her 1800 poems. It really starts with those fascicles and ratchets up from there. This is her original bed, original shawl. The Franklin stove is original, important because She doesn't have to be around a common fire downstairs. She can be in her privacy, right? The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. So she can be up here writing, not freezing to death. Over her writing table, the tiny little table in the corner, that's her writing desk. You see framed portraits of George Eliot and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The wallpaper is recreated from a scrap that they found. So the wild roses were certainly here. And this is really, we feel very close to what it would have looked like when Emily lived here. The mirror, the box, the basket, the toilet set behind you, these are all original pieces.
That is a really small desk.
Yep. It sure is. So she is writing and writing and writing. 1859, 1860, 61, 62, 63. She's on fire. At one point writing more than a poem a day. Thanks. The Civil War is raging. She's writing and writing. Hope is the thing with feathers. The brain is wider than the sky. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. All of her best known pieces, right? This is her run. And then 64 and 65 happen. And she is getting blurred vision. She's sensitive to light, getting headaches. And she spends the majority of those 2 years at a boarding house in Cambridge being treated for inflammation of the iris. So if you can imagine the terror. Here she is in the height of her creativity, and suddenly she's afraid she might lose her sight. She calls it 8 months of Siberia. They won't let her read. She comes back. First thing she does is read Shakespeare from the cupola upstairs. And then she trades in her steel nib pen and inkwell, mostly for the pencil stub. And that's would be like a whale oil lamp over there. Maybe switched to kerosene in the 1870s. But she's no longer restricted to the tiny little desk, right? She can take this pencil stub, put it in her apron pocket, and she can write wherever she is in the house. If she's baking, if she's taking care of her mother, etc. And then we get, those poems on the insides of envelopes, on the backs of recipes, all of that fun ephemera that exists, right? Also, something that happens is she takes up more and more with the white dress. So that's an exact replica of her dress. And you can see how tiny she was. Now, lots of debate about whether the white is symbolic or just practical for cleaning purposes. But certainly, she's done with the corsets. She's done with the silks, the fabrics. She's, I think, very intentionally applying herself to her craft. She's not receiving visitors in this dress, though it would have been a common dress for housework. She's not doing much of that either. Vinnie is taking over the majority of the housework. She's turning away visitors for her sister. She knows she's up to something. And she is as supportive as one can be, who doesn't understand another. Certainly, we also have that big question of who she loved. And there's speculation around pretty much anyone you can imagine in the story, most of whom I haven't had time to name today. But she does, of course, write about love. Wild nights where I would be, wild nights should be our luxury, she writes. We know about one late love in her life, Judge Otis Lord. She would have been in her late 40s. He was 18 years her senior, a friend of her father's that she connected with intellectually, exchanged letters with. He was out in Salem. There was a marriage proposal, actually. And then there is the mystery and muse of Sue. And she writes, "Be Sue while I am Emily. Be next what you have ever been, infinity." And Sue receives at least 250 of her poems, more than anyone else. Sue keeps everything, including like the little tag on the apple basket, right? These manuscripts stay with her, little notes of people she wants to read them to, things like this. We have Emily's evocative letters to Sue. We do not have Sue's letters back to Emily, and that's the missing piece. And we don't have that because Vinnie burns them along with all of the papers, right? After her sister dies, common request, protecting privacy, but then Vinnie finds the poems and does not burn the poems. There's some controversy about, Perhaps Maggie Marr also had the poems and instructions about them, because there's some evidence that Maggie had them in her trunk, but there's so many, I think they could have been in multiple places. So this is the Northwest Chamber. This house is new to the tour, and this is the room where Emily Norcross would have convalesced in her later years, the poet's mother. So she suffers a stroke in 1875, and she lives another almost 8 years. But she's somewhat incapacitated. And so Emily, Vinnie, and Maggie Marr, the maid, are caring for her here in this room. And so it's one of those moments, one of maybe the few, that Emily takes on a more traditional role. So you can imagine her kind of walking that little path between her bedroom and this room many times in her later years. Not writing as many poems in this period, definitely writing letters, partly to keep her mother connected to the outside world. And it was an intense duty, really. It was women's work to care for the sick and the dying at home. And so there was a lot to it, especially, in a house with no running water and all, it was quite a bit. But when they didn't have a chance to do this kind of work, that was a different kind of strain. And actually, Edward Dickinson, her father, had passed away the year prior in 1874, away in Boston on his own for a work trip, and he died before any of the family could get to him. So that was quite sad for a family that really saw home as such an anchor. And Edward was, he was thought of as the squire in town, right? Everything shuts down for his funeral. The church cancels their festival, Amherst College cancels classes, the shops all close. He's laid out downstairs, and Emily attends her father's funeral from her bedroom with the door cracked open. So she is fully in her reclusive stage by then. Sue Dickinson wrote Emily's obituary. It was long and lovely and appeared in the Springfield Republican, of course. And it's very Googleable. I recommend it. Sue was actually quite a lovely writer in her own right. I'll leave you with a poem. This is my letter to the world, who never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me.